Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I'm Noah. So today we're going to map out something really personal, an invisible and honestly often overwhelming psychological landscape. We're talking about my own internal journey of returning home after a prolonged absence. When we think of coming home, we usually picture celebrations, parades, right? But the internal reality, it's so much more complex and usually totally invisible to everyone else. Let's get into it.
The literal second I stepped off that plane, man, the sensory disorientation was just immediate. To the regular civilian world, it was just a typical day, right? People rushing by with their coffee cups, the clacking of rolling bags, that loud, chaotic hum of the airport. But my subjective reality, entirely different. To me, everything felt strangely quiet. After 2 years deployed overseas with the U.S. Army, my internal metronome was just completely out of sync with my environment. The world just didn't move the same way anymore. So I step out of the terminal right into the freezing Chicago rain to grab a taxi. And you gotta picture this. I'm wearing my old military jacket, lugging this heavy duffel bag. But let me tell you, standing there in the wind, that bag felt infinitely heavier than whatever physical stuff was actually packed inside it. It was like I was carrying the literal physical manifestation of an emotional weight, a burden just pulling me down with every single step I took on that wet pavement. Now, this right here is the true anatomy of alienation. Walking through my own hometown, I was totally unrecognized by strangers, which, okay, you expect that. But then, I felt unrecognized by the city itself. The streets just felt totally foreign to me. And the absolute most terrifying part, I was deeply, deeply afraid of being unrecognized by my own family. Not physically, obviously, but fundamentally. I kept wondering, would they even recognize the person I had become after everything I'd seen? Because here's the thing. When you leave, life back home just refuses to hit pause. During year one, I missed birthdays. I missed Christmas dinners. By year two, I was missing the really major milestones, like my sister's high school graduation. And these missed moments, they just stack up, creating this massive, invisible wall between you and your old life. And then came the absolute peak of this absence. 6 months prior to my return, I got the devastating news of my father's fatal heart attack. It all culminated in what I now call the desert call. I actually learned about my dad's death through this crackling, incredibly weak satellite phone connection, standing in the middle of a desert thousands of miles away. I never even got the chance to say goodbye. That singular, agonizing event became the absolute lowest point of my internal descent. It essentially formed this permanent anchor of guilt that I just dragged with me every single day from that moment forward. Okay, fast forward to the end of that taxi ride in Chicago. The car finally pulls up in front of my childhood house. It's completely dark out, except for this single lit window in the kitchen. And you'd think seeing that light cutting through the darkness would bring me comfort, right? But no. Instead, it made my internal fear just completely spike. That light meant someone was awake. That light meant my return was about to become incredibly, unavoidably real. So I'm just standing there on the porch in the freezing rain, staring at the front door, and I'm thinking, how do I even knock? It sounds like such a totally simple physical action, but psychologically, I was paralyzed. I was absolutely terrified of bridging that massive gap between my deployment and my home. The tiny distance between the porch and the inside of that house, honestly, it felt wider than the ocean I had just crossed. But turns out, I didn't have to knock. Suddenly, the door just opens. And for this breathless, endless second, my mother and I just completely froze. Neither of us moved a muscle. She just stood there, one hand covering her mouth, sheer shock practically radiating off her. It was this intense, suspended collision where my deep internal fear met external reality, and we were both just locked in place, trying to process the fact that the waiting was finally over. And then, the dam broke. She didn't even hesitate. She ran right out into the pouring rain and pulled me into the tightest embrace of my entire life. In that exact moment, that crushing physical and emotional weight I was talking about earlier, it just snapped. I literally dropped my duffel bag on the wet porch and completely broke down. All that stoicism, all those defensive walls I had built up over 2 years, they just dissolved right there into tears. As we're standing there holding each other, I whispered through my tears, "I'm sorry I wasn't here." And I wasn't just apologizing for showing up unannounced in the rain, I was letting out this immense burden of absence. I was apologizing for the missed birthdays, the graduation, and most intensely, the guilt of not being there when my father passed. It was just a complete confession of all my perceived failures.
But my mom, she just shook her head, tears in her own eyes, and offered me this pure, unconditional grace. She said, "You came back. That's all that matters." She wasn't keeping some ledger of my absences. She was entirely focused on my presence in that moment. And that single sentence, that was what started the really hard process of dismantling my guilt.
Walking inside the house after that was incredibly surreal. My senses were immediately flooded with these familiar anchors, right? The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the same family photos hanging in the hallway, that deeply comforting, completely unchanged smell of coffee. Everything looked and smelled exactly the way I had left it 2 years prior. Well, almost everything, except for one glaring, really painful void. I was immediately forced to confront the physical reality of the ghost in our house. My father's empty chair at the dinner table. You can picture it, right? A room full of warmth and memory, suddenly punctuated by an undeniable permanent absence. Seeing that empty chair, that was the exact moment the reality of his death fully transitioned from that crackling phone call in the desert to a tangible, inescapable, everyday truth. Later that night, I couldn't sleep, so I found myself sitting alone out in the garage. That garage was basically his sanctuary. I was just surrounded by his life, his old tools, his dusty baseball gloves. And right there, sitting perfectly still on his workbench, I found a folded note, written in his familiar handwriting. You know, physical artifacts hold so much power, but absolutely nothing could have prepared me for what this piece of paper actually meant. I unfolded it, and the message inside changed absolutely everything. It read, "If you're reading this, it means you made it home. I always knew you would. Don't carry guilt for protecting others. Just promise me one thing. Live the life you fought to keep." Reading my dad's final message, man, it gave me the ultimate permission I didn't even know I needed to forgive myself. It was like he reached out from the past just to lift that heavy bag off my shoulders. I mean, my hands were literally trembling as I stared at his letter. But internally, this incredible shift occurred. For the first time in years, the relentless war I had been fighting against myself finally, completely fell silent. The external storm, the rain outside, was still passing, but the internal storm had finally broken. As the rain slowly stopped outside, I experienced this massive cognitive shift. Coming home wasn't the conclusion of my journey. It wasn't the end of the story where the screen fades to black, you know? No, it was the exact opposite. It was the raw, vulnerable beginning of learning how to truly live again. It was about taking my father's mandate and figuring out how to step back into the flow of life with purpose. So, I want to leave you with this final thought regarding your own internal landscape. We all have our own deployments, our own long absences, our own reasons for building walls. What guilt are you carrying that you need permission to let go of? Because true homecoming, whether that's to a place, to a family, or just coming back to yourself, requires us to finally drop the bags we no longer need to carry. Thank you so much for walking through this explainer with me.